what it means and how much natural is the process of the movement from the body to society. This is natural. It took the Koreans 4.5 years and still it's not there yet. Yeah, so sorry.
To know about the history of finance. Still, as a Westerner fan, very good.
Testing. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second lecture of the Yu Ying-shih Lecture in History 2024 and 25. To enhance cultural exchange and academic research, the Yu Ying-shih Lecture in History was established in 2007 and co-organized by the College and the Department of History of the University of Hong Kong. We would like to express our sincere gratitude to the Xinlan Foundation for sponsoring this year's lecture. This year, we are honored to have Professor Dorothy Ko, Professor of History, Barnard College, Columbia University, as our speaker. The topic of today's lecture is the commercial value and spirit of artisans in early modern and modern China. And it will be moderated by Professor David Faure, Emeritus Professor, Department of History, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. The lecture will now begin. May I invite Professor David Faure to introduce our speaker, Professor Dorothy Ko. Professor Faure, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, people say Chinese women, illiterate and ignorant, are a docile lot. Well, that is because they haven't met Dorothy Ko. And of course, I'm not referring to her as a person in her daily life. I'm referring to her research. I know Dorothy Ko, Dorothy, if I may. I know Dorothy. I know she's written more than 3 books, and she's edited a whole lot of them and many more papers. But I know her work through 3 books. Many years ago, it is true, it was many years ago, there was a book about women who were taught not just to read and write, but also to write poetry. And for me, the big discovery in that book wasn't just that there were teachers in the cloisters, but in fact, they created companionship marriages in the 18th century in China, which is extremely comparable to what was happening in the West. And then she moved on to another argument about bound feet. And I think somewhere in the title, she suggests it is a revolutionary idea. Now, bound feet have always been associated with docile women who accepted whatever hardship that came to them. But Dorothy was arguing against that. And then she wrote about inkstone. And I thought I'd never be interested in the book on inkstone. But of course, she wasn't talking about inkstone. She's talking about the people who used and made inkstones. And she actually went to one of the villages where they were making inkstones. And that really got my attention. And as always, and I'd expect something of the sort today, if you watch out for it, there will be a sting somewhere in the argument, which would be rebellious, if I might say. So with that as an introduction, I present to you Professor Dorothy Ko.
Thank you very much, Professor Faure. I'm just grounded and speechless. It is indeed a great honor and pleasure for me to share my work with you today. To be honest, when I first received the kind invitation from Professor Faure to deliver the Yu Ying-shih Lecture in history, I was not only completely surprised, but quite frightened, in fact. What could I possibly say? What could I possibly share? After all the subjects that I am interested in, women, gender, material cultures, are exactly the ones that Professor Yu, as prolific as he was, seldom touched on, or I might say, did not seem to have ever touched on. So therefore, I would like to really sincerely thank the selection committee, as well as New Asia College and the Department of History of CUHK for taking a chance on me. So in honor of Professor Yu Ying-shih's most famous work, I titled my talk, The Commercial Ethic and Spirit of Artisans in Early Modern and Modern China. Let me just clarify 3 key terms that I would use in my talk. I use craftsman and artisan interchangeably. For very complicated reasons, if you want to know, there are differences in the meaning of these 2 words, but I'm using them interchangeably, and each term can refer to either male or female or anywhere, any gender
in between. But the third term, the artificer, is a special kind of craftsman. It is a more specific term because an artificer is a craftsman with a particular attitude about craft, about his work or her work. In making things, or 万物, the artificer or 造物者 follows the pattern and transformation of nature, whatever nature means. As we step into the 21st century, the antiquated and forgotten figure of the craftsman has made a comeback in our post-industrial societies, not only in Hong Kong, but also in America, Europe, and even China. Craftsmanship, or so-called the spirit of the craftsman, or 匠心, as the Chinese tend to call it, is a popular term that we see encounter in social media almost every day. The 匠心, or spirit of the craftsman, can be detected not only in chefs of slow artisanal food, craft beer brewers, or DIY celebrity knitters, but also Olympic champions who dedicated themselves to tireless training in pursuit of excellence and to knitting while waiting the turn at the pool. In his influential book, The Craftsman, published in 2008, sociologist Richard Sennett offers an extremely broad definition of craftsmanship. It is, quote, the skill of making things well. Good enough. Stating what every tiger mom would know, Sennett thinks that skills, be it playing the piano or mastering math, come less from natural talent, but more from constant, incessant practice day and night. Interestingly, Sennett says skill is a trained practice that is based on slow learning and on habit, essentially the formation of habit of muscles, of the brain, of hand, eye, and feet, and everything in between. Interestingly, it takes about 10,000 hours of training or experience in order to master anything, any skill with some kind of mastery. Do the quick math, 10,000 hours equals 6.9 years. If you work 8 hours a day and 180 days a year. Isn't this how long it takes to get a PhD in history? Something like that. 7 years is still the average in America. I don't know what's the average here. So in Sennett's definition, the label craftsman includes not only people who practicing crafts such as carpenters, goldsmiths, and so on, but also such modern professions as concert pianists, concert musicians, or computer programmers who ever took the 10,000 hours to nurture and, quote, intimate connection between hand and head, unquote, will develop 3 basic skills or abilities: the ability to localize, to question, and to open up. This may or may not be what most of us think of as skills or training, especially the kind of motion of opening up to the world is particularly important to Sennett, and I would come back to it over and over again. So regardless of profession, craftsmanship names an enduring basic human impulse, the desire to do something well, concretely, and for its own sake. Although Sennett does not use the term spirit of the craftsman, his definition of craftsmanship, I think, comes close to my mind. The most important and perhaps controversial aspect of Richard Sennett's argument is that this spirit of the craftsman is not just a personal attribute, embodied by concert musicians and so on. It has a social, outward, or collective dimension, and is in fact one of the foundations of democracy. Why, you might wonder? This is so because the craft of making physical things provides insight into the techniques of experience that can shape our dealings with others. So a craftsman is not just someone who hides in a workshop and, pull ceramic bowls, but a craftsman is necessarily someone who connects his world to that of the outside and of the, world of material environment. So the challenges of crafting, like working with the resistance of materials or managing ambiguity, is it hot enough, moist enough? This ability or these abilities are instructive in understanding the resistance that people harbor to one another or the uncertain boundaries between people. In other words, the functioning of a healthy democracy depends not just on legislation or electoral politics, but it depends on building and sustaining strong and robust social relationships. And as we know, in a complex society, there are conflicting opinions and values necessarily, and crafts skills naturally translate into people skills. The spirit of the craftsman, which involves the skills of localizing a problem, questioning received wisdom, in opening up, working with resistance, managing ambiguity, anticipating future problems and challenges so that you can, respond in advance, and revising one's strategies according your anticipation of future problems. All of these things, according to Richard Sennett, provide the best training for a public-minded citizen in a functioning democratic society. The next section is called The Spirit of the Craftsman, according to Li Keqiang. The term spirit of the craftsman, or 工匠精神, first appeared in an official PRC document in March 2016, when Premier Li Keqiang delivered his 2016 government work report to the 4th session of the 12th National People's Congress. Although his definition of the spirit of the craftsman is as broad as Richard Sennett's, the premier saw its value not in political development, but in economic development. Li Keqiang's goal was to, quote, improve the quality of our consumer products, unquote, by, quote, encouraging our enterprises to launch customization and flexible manufacturing while nurturing a spirit of craftsmen that strive for incessant excellence so as to increase the variety of products, improve their quality, and create more new Chinese brands. So notably, this is an important point that I won't have time to go into. The spirit of the craftsman here refers primarily to the spirit of factory workers, not entrepreneurs, at least in 2016. Throughout 2016, President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang gave a series of talks articulating what they meant by the spirit of the craftsman. For example, in a meeting with a group of entrepreneurs in Zhejiang, including Jack Ma, who soon disappeared, Xi Jinping explained that innovation requires, quote, dedication to a task to the utmost degree, 专注于把一件事做到极致. In a Central Politburo meeting 2 months later, Xi Jinping discussed the challenges of urban development in Beijing. And he urged the cadres to dedicate themselves to, quote, one task after another, magnify the spirit of the craftsman, and keep pushing to make progress with a focused heart mind. 精心推进. I actually don't know what it means. What do you 推进? But anyway, 精心推进 became then, recurred in journalistic kind of commentary for a few months. Li Keqiang, in making his rounds in the provinces that year, also championed the spirit of the craftsman in a series of meetings with educators, students, entrepreneurs, cadres, and factory workers, deeming it crucial for building up China as a 人才大国, a powerhouse of talents. And plus a country of high-end brands that can satisfy in its own customers. So some of you might remember that in 2016, Li Keqiang was pushing his Made in China 2025 project, which aimed at a structural transformation of the Chinese economy, from mass production to customized or personalized and flexible manufacturing that produces high-end consumer goods. So Li told a group of workers in a lorry factory, quote, as a revolution in quality, the Made in China project has to rely on the spirit of craftsmen and technological innovation. So the spirit of the craftsman and technological information, from tradition to modernity. The revolution is centered on the consumers. This is a very interesting expression, isn't it? The revolution is centered on the consumers. You have to respond to the constant demands of the consumers before our brand Made in China can be revolutionized from below. Li Keqiang's rhetoric of appealing to Chinese increasingly sophisticated consumers was a really smart move, and it engendered enthusiastic response from the netizens. The term 工匠精神, the spirit of artisans, was selected to be one of 10 trendy terms of 2016, along with the 歌谣 slouch, 洪荒之力, I don't know how to translate it, and intelligent toilet seats. An article in the Guangming Daily of March 12, 2016, admitted that the Made in China label at present is a profound embarrassment. And the writer, this is from the Guangming Daily, the writer said that he understood why Chinese tourists had to spend 1.2 trillion yuan overseas in 2015 to buy foreign-made consumer goods to take home, because the local ones just keeps breaking down, right? On the eve of the May 1st Labor Day kind of stampede to Japan, an article in the People's Daily gave the list of luxury goods that exemplified the spirit of the craftsman. Guess what they are? Some of you might remember this. Swiss watches, German automobiles, BMWs, Beamers and Mercedes, Italian handmade leather goods, Japanese electronic toilets, and rice cookers. I find it a bit hilarious that the spirit of the craftsman is reduced to such imports as heated toilet seats, 智能马桶盖, but this is no laughing matter. The Chinese government's pursuit of the spirit of the craftsman was also directed towards artisans in such, heritage crafts as, eng making in Huizhou or Kesi tapestry, actually in Tibet, no less. There was a project trying to teach the poor, impoverished Tibetan women how to make Kesi. Of course, I'm being sarcastic. But clearly, the main target are the factory workers, technicians, and managers in the manufacturing sectors, as well as the cadres in the PRC bureaucracy, in the CCP bureaucracy. If we compare Li Keqiang's spirit of the craftsman with Richard Sennett's, one of the most striking similarities they share is the broad, expensive definition of who is a craftsman. It essentially encompasses everybody in society, especially those in the high-tech industries in the US, for Sennett, and for Li Keqiang, workers in the modern manufacturing plants in China. But the differences between the two are also obvious. Whereas Sennett one gives a very clear definition of what this spirit means for him, essentially meticulous 10,000-hour training and the acquisition of skills that opens up an individual to his or her environment. The PRC leaders, in contrast, use vague standard phrases such as 精益求精, 专注于把一件事做到极致, or even the more vague 真心推进, as I really, so all the, reporters and writers were kept, expounding on these terms, but nobody knows what they mean. Also different, second difference, is the attitude towards modern science and technology. Richard Sennett's motivation in promoting the spirit of the craftsman is to, in modern society, stem from a profound disenchantment with and mistrust of modern science and technology. He was horrified that the fossil fuel that took Mother Earth 1 million years of compression to produce was burned up in only 1 year. So, he wrote that he investigated the artisanal workshops in ancient Greece in order to search for a sustainable values in order to chart an alternative path to modern development for all societies. But the PRC leaders have not lost faith in modern science. To the contrary, in championing craftsmanship, they are looking to modern AI technology to help China transition to a post-industrial consumer society. This is perhaps their most salient difference, the third one. Senet's craftsmanship is distinctly anti-utilitarian in the sense that it is the desire to do something well for its own sake. But the PRC leader's spirit of the craftsman is utilitarian to the extreme, whatever it takes, wherever it comes from, to benefit the economy, the country, and the made in China brand that it is striving to build. Be that as it may, as a historian of craft and material cultures, I have found the rediscovery, perhaps invention is a better term, of the spirit of the craftsman in modern life in both the West and China a significant development. But I find somehow the modern concerns being articulated by both Senet and Li Keqiang and many other commentators, I just find them too modern for me as a historian of the early modern period of Mingqing China. So I wonder, was there a spirit of the craftsman in Mingqing society? If so, can we retrieve what the craftspeople themselves have to say about their experiences and their world, instead of relying on the official chroniclers of society, that is to say, the scholars? Lastly, a very simple question that I find actually really difficult to answer, especially after Senet and Li Keqiang's broad definition. Who exactly is a craftsman? And who decides who is a craftsman and who is not? I ask this question because when you think about it, to the extent that the housewife was tasked with making things and provisioning the family with food and wine, why can't she be considered a craftsman? So with these questions, let us turn to Professor Yu Ying-shih's classic study to see if his examination of the spirit of the merchant is useful at all as our guide to our quest for the spirit of the craftsman in Mingqing society. In his classic book, The Religious, Ethic, and Mercantile Spirit in Early Modern China, originally published in Chinese in 1987, Professor Yu Ying-shih offered a forceful rebuttal of Max Weber's verdict that China was incapable of developing capitalism on its own because traditional China lacked a real transcendental religion like Protestantism. Confucianism was simply too worldly to develop a concept of calling, a transcendental calling, or tianzhi, that Calvinism did. Those who have read Professor Yu Ying-shih's book might remember the confident way in which Professor Yu took down Max Weber, who did not, of course, know Chinese. Weber was simply wrong, dead wrong, because he lacked, quote, basic knowledge of the historical facts, unquote, about China, especially about New Confucianism. But Professor Yu said, quote, we should not be too harsh on Weber, 从宽发落, given the primitive state of sinology in the West during his lifetime. So although kind, Professor Yu minced no words. So I would like to take a little time, slowly, to review Professor Yu's main arguments to savor the masterful way in which he builds his case. In my reading, what the really wonderful, capable translator, Goebbels, rendered as mercantile spirit should be better render the spirit of the merchant, because the 商人精神 is not a free floating Geist, spirit in German, but the spirit embodied in a group of flesh and blood people called 商人 or merchants. This embodiment means a lot to my reading of Professor Yu and Weber. In any case, according to Professor Yu, this spirit of the merchant, 商人精神, is none other than New Confucianism, 新儒, or the founding principle of New Asia College. Professor Yu documented how New Confucianism was provoked by the challenges posed by New Chan, 新禅宗, founded by Niu Zu Huining in the 7th century. In Professor Yu's telling, Xin Chan, New Chan, revitalized medieval Buddhism by establishing a new economic ethic that is worldly in orientation in its valuing of industry and frugality. Monk Bai Zhang Huaihai's motto, one day without labor, one day without food, Tiger Mom, and encapsulates the corporeal demands of the new regime of Puqing, or communal labor for devotees in the Tang and the Song. Widely accepted in society by the Song, this new worldly orientation among the New Chan teaching inspired the 4 new Taoist schools that rose between the northern and the southern Song, which in turn spur a worldly turn, 日式转向, among such Tang, Confucian revivalists such as Han Yu, despite their ostensible anti-Buddhist stance. And Professor Yu Ying-shih quoted Han Yu's a very interesting line, which I put on the PPT. 韩一即基石在纺织耕耘. So the foundation of the worldly ethic of New Confucianism is actually the domestic craft and the laboring bodies of working with textile for the women and working in the fields for the men as the foundation of social order. At the same time, in the Tang and the Song, competition with New Chan encouraged the Song Neo-Confucianists to develop their own theology or theory of the mind and human nature, a world of heavenly principles, or 天理世界, as a new Confucian other world, a transcendental realm that existed in palpable tension with the realm of this world, the 日式转向, causing severe anxieties among the true believers of New Confucianism. So in this way, Professor Yu argues that New Confucianists, quote, criticized and went beyond Chan by pushing this worldly spirit to its utmost limits. The Jing, or seriousness, or 传神专一, in Zhu Xi's model, seriousness pervading activities and tranquility, 静观动静, gives rise to a spirit of seriousness in one's vocation, or 敬业, according to Professor Yu Ying-shih, that is akin to Calvinist calling or vocation. In this way, the spirit of the merchant is rooted in the mutual borrowings and challenges of the three teachings of Chan Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, or 三教合一. Professor Yu's key argument that I've summarized up till now is so counterintuitive that it bears repeating. There is no independent spirit of the merchant. There is no independent spirit of the merchant. It is none other than New Confucianism, developed during the Tang Song transition through the Northern and Southern Song and the Ming. For all the disagreements between the two Song New Confucianists, Zhu Xi and Lu Jiuyuan, both agreed on this key point, that the target of Confucian teachings, New Confucian teachings, should extend from the scholars, 士, to all people, or min, all are part of the new social order called 经世. And this new social order is akin to the Calvinist holy community of the chosen few. The commercial development in Chinese society from the Song to the Ming, in fact, allows some merchants to acquire not only financial capital, but also cultural capital, resulting in a blending of the identities and values of scholars and merchants, 世商不分，四民相混. Ming Confucian thinker Wang Yangming and his followers of the Taizhou school further developed the inner worldly asceticism, 日式苦行, heralded by the Song New Confucianist, and took the spirit of the merchant to new heights. In his famous tome, Inscriptions for the Suzhou merchant Fang Lin, written in 1525, Wang Yangming affirmed the complete equality of social status and moral status among scholars, farmers, artisans, and merchants when he wrote, the four categories of people were engaged in different occupations, but followed the same way. They were at one in giving full realization to their minds. 四民异业而同道，其尽心而. Professor Yu has astutely observed that Wang Yangming's admission of a vocation or calling, 业, for merchants, or actually according to Wang Yangming, to be exact, for each of the four categories of people, they each have a 业 or calling or vocation. This is the most direct rebuttal of Max Weber's dismissal of China's lack. In discussing craftsmanship, Richard Sennett explains that Weber's notion of Beruf or vocation is a process with two phases. One is the gradual accumulation of knowledge and skill. So the operative word is gradual. It exists in real time, not in momentarily, ideally in 10,000 hours, right? And second phrase is the ever stronger, again, a gradually unfolding realization, conviction that one was meant to do this one particular thing in one's lifetime. So the prolonged experience of a home, which is a really important word in Max Weber's and Professor Yu's actually rendition, is an event, action, or relationship that turns one outward. It's a kind of, there are two kinds of experiences. One that turns you 内卷, involuting, and the other that turns you outward to embrace the world. This prolonged and gradual experience in honing a particular set of skills is conducive to a gradual development of an inner realization, that of a natural calling. From Professor Yu's explanation, we now know that this German or Weberian notion of calling or vocation, with its double-faced kind of inward and then opening up outward dimension, is virtually identical to Wang Yangming's notion of ye, of calling, which lies at the heart of the spirit of the merchant, and by implication, also the spirit of the craftsman and that of a farmer, right? Because 市民, 一二儿童道, the four groups of people, the four occupations, they have different callings, they do different things, but the moral capacity is the same. So the spirit of the merchant is the spirit of the artisan, is the spirit of the farmer. End of story, we can all go home. No, this is the catch that David was talking about. But first, there's this one passage that I love, because I think it speaks to Professor Yu's discussion very much. So I'm offering it as a footnote. Not only have big merchants come into their own by the mid to late Ming, so too have top-ranking artisans. Writing in the Qianlong era, the scholar official Wan Kuisheng observed a seismic shift in the late Ming, which is the professionalization of the crafts, of certain crafts, leading to increased specialization and enhanced prestige of such fields as jade carving, horn carving, rhinoceros horn, and silver smithing, but also fields using humble materials such as bamboo, pewter, paper, and candle wax. It's the exquisite skills provided by the craftsmen that added value in the making process, turning these common materials as bamboo into luxury goods. Wan Kuisheng used the term, actually, ye, vocation, to refer to these craft fields, and made the shocking suggestion that these successful artisans who manage their family businesses so well that they became a brand deserve far more respect than those scholars who, quote, hold fast to the ignorance, sit bored on their thumbs, and die without ever winning a degree or post, or perish in oblivion. Wan Kuisheng himself, a high-ranking scholar, was just full of contempt of these failed scholars. So we don't have to wait until, for Yu Ying-shih or Lu Shen to have that shuan contempt for scholars. In contrast, in Wan Kuisheng's eye, the artisan achieved the ultimate goal of attaining immortality with their embodied skills, an achievement that was denied the mediocre scholar. The carving knife has become more powerful and lucrative than the writing brush. So this observation of a reversal of fortune between the scholar and the craftsman reveals a further deeper dimension to the phenomenon of the disruption of the four categories of people in the late Ming described by Yu Ying-shih. Not only did merchants and their sons study Confucian classics internalize new Confucian values and become virtually scholars, such as the merchant Wang Qishu, right? Resulting in the merging of the categories of scholars and merchants. In Wang Kuisheng's estimation, the professional artisans who achieve artistic and economic success by their mindful hands have risen actually to the top of the hierarchy of the four people. They even surpass the scholars in the likelihood of being remembered in posterity by us. So we have seen that Wang Yangming's recognition of the existence of divergent callings of the four categories of people, 四民异业而同道，其尽心而, this allow merchants, craftsmen, and farmers to claim parity with the scholar. Significantly, the attitude of Jinxin, giving full realization to one's mind, unifies the spirit of all four groups. Aha. So I was delighted at some point when I was writing this talk, struggling. I was delighted to have finally found my code or keyword to the spirit of the craftsman. Now, all I need to do, I thought, is to find the specific quotes in the craftsman's own words. So I pulled down all my crafts manuals. Sorry that the versions I'm showing are very modern versions because they look better. So I pulled down all the crafts manuals from the Yuan, Ming, and Qing periods from my bookshelf and searched not only for the word 尽心, sincerity to the utmost, full realization to one's mind, but also similar expressions. Really, when you come to think of about it, when you think of it, similar expressions used by Li Keqiang or Xi Jinping, 专精精细, dedication, sincerity, seriousness, and dedication. But sailor, to my surprise, none of these words ever occurred even once in all of these guidebooks. Not even once. These manuals document meticulously the various materials required, the names of the different parts, exact measurements, the entire work process, and it always includes some practical words of caution or advice. Not only is there a total absence of keywords, of the keywords I was looking for, there is no description whatsoever of the mentality or attitude of the craftsman, of the mind of the craftsman, spirit of the craftsman at all. These are technical manuals, not philosophical treatises. And whoever compiled these manuals seem profoundly unconcerned with the state of the mind or spirit of the artisan. Too bad for me. This was on the verge of, I was packing my bag, so I was ready to go, but still I haven't found the crux of my talk. An even bigger surprise is that the only exception to this rule are embroidery manuals written by or attributed to women authors. The Minggu family embroidery master Han Ximeng, for example, was said by her husband Gu Shouqian to be attentive to both the weather conditions and her own emotional state when she picked up the needle. Quote, she dares not engage in embroidery on gloomy days of wind and rain. Only when the sky is bright and the rain had ceased, the birds are chirping pleasantly and the flowers fragrant, she would work to absorb the lively chi in front of her eyes and stitch it into her piece of Ling trail. Han Ximeng imagined herself a conveyor of heaven's luminous qi through her body, her eyes, hands, and mind to her piece of silk. So as a collaborator of the sun, the birds, and flowers, she became a creator of things, an artificer, to whom the distinction of inner and outer ceased to exist. Although Han Ximeng did not, or Gu Shouqian, did not use the words 尽心 or 专精, 经世, her husband's description of her seriousness come close to an explanation of these key words might mean in the Ming period. The late Qing gentry wife Ding Pei echoed these sentiments of Han Ximeng's. Ding opened her manual of embroidery, 绣谱, with her admonition that, quote, selecting your place or site of work, 择地, is of the utmost importance for the embroiderer. This is so because, quote, whether your artistry is refined or coarse depends on your heart mind. Whether your heart mind is refined or coarse depends on your surroundings. If your windows are clear and your tables clean, even the unskilled can change your impression. If your room is dark and your lamp dingy, even the skilled would lose her stride. So Ding Pei further explained the importance, or not so, Ding Pei then go on and explain the importance of xian, leisure or timing, or time, tranquility, 静, brightness, 明, and cleanliness, thus 3 jie, as the perfect states of both the embroiderer's body, mind, and her physical environment. What do we make of this? What do we make of this? Gu Shouqian, Ding Pei were both classically educated. So my reading is that in an effort to elevate the feminist art to be, or the feminine art to be on a par with those of the Confucian gentlemen, these writers had deliberately used the Confucian ethical framework to Confucianalize the craft of embroidery, if you may. It is therefore not surprising that we can find traces of the spirit of merchant discussed by Yu Ying-shih, which is, as we now remember, none other than New Confucianism. In these descriptions of the spirit of the embroiderer, instead of assuming that all craft manuals other than the embroidery manuals embodied a spirit of the artisan, and the mistake that I made earlier, we should first ask a more fundamental question. Why does this manual or technical record exist? Why did someone feel compelled to write it down and expend considerable resources and effort to get it printed? Most craft manuals actually hover between 2 poles for bureaucratic accounting and for transmitting technical know-how, and they have to be interpreted differently, but I won't have time to talk about that difference. So an even more important question is, who needs to know how to read and write? What good is literacy or a text to a craftsman? Does a carpenter or potter need Neo-Confucian teachings to do his job, say to design or build a Huanghuali canopy bed, or to shape and fire a human-sized dragon urn in Jingdezhen without its body's cracking? Does a master craftsman even need writings or text at all? There are several inkstone carving families in Zhaoqing, Guangdong, for example, who have thrived and survived through generations since the Ming unbroken generations, and they have never felt the need to write down instructions in a manual. The reason is not because they are literate. At least the modern ones are literate, but because they did not need to commit their know-how to writing. The stability of the family business is such that they did not have to migrate from the native place to look for a job in some other places. So you can just simply rely on face-to-face instruction. So crafts manuals, we know, tend to be written when the craft is being threatened or when the craft community starts to disperse or scattered. The spirit of the artisan, if it does exist, has to be sought from an entirely different plane than the spirit of the merchant. One that is distinct from the world of Song Yuan Ming New Confucian book learning. And this is that catch that David was referring to. Max Weber's discourse of natural calling, Calvinism and capitalism, is the discourse developed in the historical context of the height of German or Prussian industrialization in the last quarter of the 19th century. So by nature, Weber's discourse is a modernist, secular, and rationalistic one. In our search for the spirit of craftsmen in pre-modern China, a more fruitful point of departure is the Kaogongji, or the artificer's record, compiled in 5th century BCE and incorporated into the classic rites of Zhou during the Western Han. Joseph Needham calls this book, which details over 20 crafts, central to the state of Qi in the early Warring States period, quote, the world's oldest encyclopedia of technology, unquote. To my mind, I think this is a misnomer because, like Weber, Needham is just being too modern in their premises, in their assumptions. To me, they are trying to shoehorn a cosmological text or a religious text, in Weber's case, into a secular rationalizing frame. In contrast, the Kaogongji does not describe a rational universe that is familiar to us moderns. It conjoins the intangible, the world of Li Yue, and the tangible, the world of Wu, or the world of things. It is not a human-centered world at all. Humans were just one of the factors in the artificing, in the making of things. Earlier, I defined the artificer, the 造物者, as a special kind of craftsman, in that artificing, or 造物, refers to crafting things according to the natural pattern of heaven. The Kaogongji exemplifies this cosmological correlative thinking. The practice of craft or artificing is an act of world making, bringing together the realm of heaven and the human realm, including the human realm, actually including the earth and its myriad creatures, minerals, and stones. This passage you are looking at in the introduction of the Kaogongji captures the high value of craftsmanship in an interconnected, correlative world. In that world, The spirit of the craftsman is also the body of the craftsman. Both the spirit and body are in engagement with the materials used and their natural environments. The timeliness of heaven, the qi of the earth, the beauty of materials, the skills of the artificer. If these four conditions come together, then excellent things can be formed, made. If the material was good and the artificer was skilled, and nonetheless no good product was created, then the season was not right, and one did not get the di qi, the qi of the earth. Of the four essential elements, 天时, 地气, 财美, 工巧, 3 are actually non-human, right? 天时, 地气, 财美, heaven, earth, and materials. They are non-human factors. Only the last of the four pertains to the creativity of the artificer. But even here, the artificer is less an individual genius, but more a collaborator with heaven, or what we might call nature in the modern sense. It is heaven which mandates the seasonal changes, the variations in the moisture content in the atmosphere and in the soil, not to mention the quality and quantity of such natural resources as wood, bamboo, plants, and minerals. The artificer or craftsman is less a stand-alone individual, but more one link in a long chain of progenitors, a generations-long craft tradition, if we may. On a day-to-day level, the craftsman's job is more repetitive than creative. In order to innovate, the craftsman has to first follow the established rules and regulations of the trade. 10,000 hours. This is the meaning of the skill of the artificer, 工巧, one that is completely at odds with our modern usage of modern image of the craftsman as the creative genius artist who creates brilliant one-off works of arts from scratch, right? Earlier, we have seen discussions of di qi, qi from the earth, in the teachings of the embroiderer of Han Ximeng and Ding Pei in their embroidery manuals. So in the interest of time, I will skip this element to focus on 天时, time or timeliness of heaven, and 地气, the and the 才美, the beauty of materials. For it is in these two elements that we can discern the salient difference between an pre-industrial craftsman and a modern craftsman. So the term time, 时, in the term has two meanings. One is duration, right? Time as duration. And two is seasonality, and this is timeliness, 时. Duration refers to the ultimate test of a perfect product, essentially whether something would last or not. The wooden beam of your house should last hundreds of years without falling down, right? But as for seasonality, I think that we Cantonese or even non-Cantonese in Hong Kong are very familiar with this,不時不吃, from our dining tables. You only eat what is in season. In the US, for example, we are supposed to eat fresh oysters only when the name of the month has the R in it. That is, no oysters in May, June, July, and August in the summer. Why? Because you eat a bad one and die. So this is seasonality as being in tune with the time of heaven. The season for craftsmen affects both the properties of materials and the techniques that the craftsman uses. The 6th century compendium of agricultural knowledge, the 齐民要术, the techniques for the people's welfare, instructs the woodworker from the lower reaches of the Yellow River that the timber logged in the 4th and the 7th months are strong, resilient, and devoid of bugs. But other untimely wood, even though they are not logged during these 2 best, seasonal months, even bad wood can be improved and made impervious to bugs if it is floated on water for a month or dry slowly over fire. So in the pre-industrial world, before raw materials are given standardized sizes and properties, the woodworker needed to scrutinize a piece of timber or to know where it came from, to deduce when the tree was actually cut in order to select the most appropriate treatment or technique to apply to this piece of wood. So dealing with non-standard materials naturally in this way requires a kind of knowledge and judgment honed from at least 10,000 hours of experience. Historian of craft Xu Yi emphasizes that this knowledge is empirically based, accumulated through the practical experience and experimentation of generation upon generation of woodworkers. This empirical knowledge was systematized in the 3rd component of 才美. Materials have their property in the 考工记. Xu Yi explains that this knowledge of materials have their beauty involves 2 aspects. One is knowing the 物理 or the nature of the materials, and their 物性, the material qualities. So it's really difficult to translate these 2 terms into English, but in Chinese, I think you all know what the difference is. By 物理, nature of materials, he means the inherent physical properties of a natural substance, its appearance, relative weight, color, structure, tensile strength, composition, density, porosity, moisture content, oil content, and so on. But 物性, material qualities of a substance, refers to attributes that are less tangible, which is rooted in a human being's innate understanding and sensory experience of that substance, be it 温, 凉, 寒, 热, warm, cool, cold, hot, as stated in the 12th century medical treatise. In other words, the 物性 material qualities of wood, bamboo, or copper can only be known by its interaction with the craftsman's body and its material effect on the craftsman and the user's body. For example, indigo is a dye that is also a medicine, and the touch of indigo dyed cloth, right, such as the jeans colored, the touch of that cloth on one's skin is supposedly has a therapeutic effect. And the sap of a lacquer tree also heals and preserves the wood of a lacquer cabinet, making it and its contents resistant to insect infestations. So this is one of the most insightful arguments of Professor Xu, which opens up so many doors for me mentally, that craftsmanship is closely related to medicine and healing in the Chinese tradition. and that the best compendium of the Chinese craftsman's material knowledge is in fact the physician Li Shizhen's 本草纲目 Materia Medica. So I think that for those who are interested in history of craft, the spirit of craftsmen, 本草纲目 is awaits your rereading. So time, seasonality, the qi of the earth, the nature of materials, and a skilled body mind, these four elements described in the 考工记 lie at the heart of craftsmanship in the pre-industrial world. They amount to the spirit of the craftsman, if we want to use this modern term. Although seldom quoted verbatim in crafts manuals in the Mingqing period, but this passage in the 考工记 provides us the secret code that unlock the message in each of these Mingqing craftsman manuals to know what materials to use, what techniques to apply, and a particular place and a particular time is to know how to make a perfect meal, a perfect suzhou garden, a perfect water pump in all its specificity of the here now. It is in this specificity we can discern the most important difference between the knowledge of the craftsman and the knowledge of the scholar. The knowledge of the craftsman is concrete and not generalizable, which is the polar opposite of the métier of the scholar, which is to generalize and to theorize. So although equally derived from experimentation and empirical experience, the craftsman's spirit of knowledge, or the craftsman's spirit or knowledge, is not science, quote unquote, as we know it. Neither can the craftsman knowledge be reduced to that of the Confucian and modern scholar due to this resistance to generalization. So epistemologically, I think there is a big gulf between these two. So if we look to the 考工记, this is the last section, although it's quite long. But I've been waiting my entire life to do this. If we look to the 考工记 instead of the modern definitions of the spirit of the craftsman, we may readily see that the Confucian housewife is very much every ounce a craftsman. The tasks assigned to her, the provision of food and wine, as well as dispensing healing advice or medicine to the family, these are entirely artisanal tasks that require intimate understanding of seasonality, of the qi of the earth, the nature of materials, and embodied skills. Like the craftsman, the housewives learn from her forebears by hewing to the precedents set by her mother and mother-in-law. Her body is trained to follow the rules and regulations passed on through the configuration of the kitchen stove and the placement of the kitchen utensils. There's no artificial separation between mental and manual work or mind and hand when you're cooking. Like that of the craftsman, the work performed by the housewife in order to sustain the entire family is productive, surely, but very boring and repetitive, right? So feminist scholars have reminded us that in pre-modern China, as in Europe, it was gender bias that created an artificial distinction, ouch, between men's work in the public spheres as real, remunerable work and female domestic work as not craft and not work, and therefore not paid. Richard Sennett points out that in medieval Europe, this gendering of skills and capabilities was justified by scientific theories at the time, which credited men with muscle strengths in the hands and legs versus women who were endowed with inner organ strengths at the womb. Likewise, as we know, traditional Chinese medicine ascribes a deficient body of yin to females. So entrenched is this bias of domestic labor is not real work in the field of Chinese studies that it took pioneers such as anthropologist Hill Gates and Francesca Bray to revise the stereotypical understanding and for us to reimagine the female-centered domestic sphere as a vibrant space of cultural and economic production and meaning. As many of you might know, Francesca Bray's influential study places the housewife at the center of Chinese culture and technology. Culture to Bray equals technology. It is none other than all the things, the sum total of things that men and women do in order to live. That's all. And you can, so Bray calls this kind of technology in the domestic space gynecology. The domestic becomes a space of decorum. The technology is female-centered and body-centered. And as we know, she gave us shocking examples of Song and Ming women performing birth control. And the domestic space is also a space for economic productivity, such as textile work. So her theoretical intervention is hugely important because it broadens the meaning of technology to include traditional handwork, but I think it requires further refinement on your part in the form of site-specific fieldwork. After all, as the anthropologist Chen Yingshun reminds us, the daily tasks and survival tactics of housewives in, say, the mountainous areas of Guizhou, where timber logging was the mainstay of the family livelihood, the daily task and survival tactics are entirely different from those of families engaging in rice cultivation, for example, in Pearl River Delta, right? So I have not done the research myself. My intention here just to encourage some of you, at least some of you, to take this on. Recently, in the English-speaking world, the study of the history of work has attracted a lot of attention. It is really hot. The alienating and dehumanizing nature of work in our post-industrial capitalist society has led to, as we know, passive resistance such as Tangping or lying flat movement against the relentless 996 regime. Although the field of labor studies in the past tended to be dominated by Marxist historians and economists, recent scholars have applied a number of other theoretical frameworks that I think is worth using along with the Marxist one. One promising analytic frame is that of the Chicago School Sociology of Work, which sprung from participant observer studies of a variety of occupations in the mid-20th century at the height of the American consumer revolution, defining occupations by the techniques needed and the object of technique, in other words, on what or whom are these skills applied. The sociologists considered change over time and variety across space in the formation, generation after generation of the various occupations of the years. So another example is the Netherlands-based project, Global Collaboratory of the History of Labor Relations, which seeks to develop an inclusive database and categories of labor in the globe from 1500, so it's highly historical, to 2000. Both projects seek to retrieve the experiences of non-native workers, especially from non-modern and non-Western time spaces. And I think that studies of the work of the Chinese housewife in all her regional and ethnic specificities would make valuable contributions to this project. So you should really apply and go work with them. Some of the case studies I have found insightful, including anthropologist Mariley Flitch and her former student Wu Xiujie, studies of the everyday technology controlled by domestic women in Manchuria in the 1980s. Flitch's ethnography of the Kang, the heated platform bed, reveals a sophisticated system of knowledge related to the dangerous management of firing, of the firing temperature of the heave of the Kang, from the finger games and ditty, folk songs, transmitted by these rural peasant housewives. So you're looking at one of the finger games teaching the children essentially the interior architectural space of the house itself. So the spatial orientation of the stove and the Kang and other spaces, which side is too hot to sit on, which side is safe to work on at certain hours of the day. The Kang is not just a heating device. It is highly dangerous. You can char your behind if you sit at the wrong end at the wrong hour and so on. So this is part of everyday technology. And the Taiwan anthropologist Chen Ying-shih remarkable research of the domestic laboring lives of housewives in Huizhou and Hakka families in Fujian and Taiwan has also given me a lot of thought, for a lot of food for thought. For immigrant Hakka families from Fujian that settle in Meinong in Tainan, on lands that used to be grazing land shared by two groups of indigenous people, the Pingpu and the Nanzhou. Life was so dangerous that when they went to the riverbanks to wash their clothes, they developed the habit of facing not the river, not the water that they use, but with the back facing the river and the eyes looking at the path to see if some enemies is coming to attack them. So Chen Ying-shih calls this instinct habitus or 生存心态. She actually credits Pierre Bourdieu, who coined this term habitus, but in my reading, hers is a more creative rendition with new meanings than Bourdieu. The term 生存, meaning both living from day to day to eke out a living economically, but also survival in precarious times. 生存 mandates an alertness to one's surroundings, to one's environment, that reminds me of the dual inward, outward orientation of the craftsman with a vocation calling or year. The housewife also has to be attuned to her environment in order to protect herself and her family while sustaining their livelihood and health. This is quite the opposite of the conventional image of the housewife as a helpless prisoner condemned to performing tedious, repetitive chores. If you're interested in the textual sources that Chen used to mesh with the field work, we can talk about it later. But more than any other studies, she conveys a vivid picture of the Hakka housewife as a polymath craftsman, some even behaving like the master of a family business. They invest their money in land and, grow the business and so on. The choreographing an astonishing array of activities, from purchasing lands, planting tobacco, pounding rice, to pickling vegetables, all requiring exacting skills and coordination in timing. Some of you are more familiar with actually the related studies on Hakka women than I am, and you may know actually other resources. But in a nutshell, I think it is really high time for us to put the Chinese housewives from the diverse ecological, economic, and ethnic backgrounds or environments on the map of a comparative and global studies of non-elite workers. This would be a significant step towards a leveling of the hierarchy of head over hand or mental work over manual work that is so prevalent still in our social structure. So I have three kind of observations to make in summary. Professor Yu Ying-shih's tireless research and voluminous publications in an extremely productive life, I think, were motivated by desire, in part by desire to supply the basic information to English readers like Max Weber, who knew so little about Chinese history, and yet they are so willing to write books about it. And in so doing, Professor Yu wished to create an intellectual space for informed conversations about Chinese history in a global comparative frame, right? This is how I really admire Professor Yu's contributions, even though I may or may not understand what he's talking about. It is in this spirit that I offer my response to Professor Yu's influential thesis on the mercantile spirit in China by looking at what the master did not say, 子不语, the labor and skills of artisans and housewives. Before wrapping up, allow me to pay tribute to the intellectual style of Professor Yu. Yu Ying-shih, among others, was a concrete thinker. He was able to select just the right quote from a fountain of textual sources to make just the right specific point, pushing his argument forward step by step, word by word. In fact, he argues specifically and explicitly in favor of a case study approach over generalization. 没有任何一般性的公式可以取代具体的个案研究。A second signature to my mind of Professor Yu's approach to intellectual history is his recognition that ideas arose from specific social contexts and in turn have to be assessed by their social impact or effect in the world. In other words, ideas do not exist in a vacuum or in an isolated, pristine textual universe as a hovering ghost or geist. Ideas are alive in the world, and ideas are observable from the behavior or writings of real embodied flesh and blood men and women. I think there's no better indication of the fact that Yu's method as a scholar is rooted in his commitment to the intellectual activism of Xinru, of Neo-Confucianism. In both of these approaches, I would like to suggest Yu Ying-shih is working in an epistemological space that is akin to that of a craftsman, characterized as it is by a dedication to specificity. However, a third trademark of Yu Ying-shih, which is his mastery of and reliance on written text, especially texts associated with famous historical figures and the persons such as biographies, 个言, 语录. All of these texts marked him as a scholar and posed considerable difficulty as I search for the spirit of artisans from such texts as craft manuals. So the lesson is simple. In studying material cultures, we should by all means read texts if they are useful, but we should also be attentive to the inherent biases and limitations of various genres of texts. Second, I think that a lasting one of the lasting impacts of Professor Yu's work is his conclusion that there are indigenous cultural elements in traditional Chinese society in the 17th to 18th centuries that are conducive to modernity. So from tradition to modernity is a seamless transition and not an abrupt change. New Confucian teachings and kinship-based social organizations are the two salient examples of the tradition that he offered that are still valuable in modern society. On the issue of science in pre-modern China, however, I respectfully disagree with Professor Yu, who regretted that New Confucians did not develop a concept of dominion over nature. And therefore, China lacked science and technology in the modern sense. My reading of the meanings of 天时, time or timeliness of heaven, and 才美, beauty of materials in 考工技, suggests that the craft trades offer a robust space for experimentation and accumulation of empirical knowledge, the kind of bodily engagements with the material world that amounts to a kind of material empiricism. Such European historians as Pamela Smith have written about how material empiricism served as the foundation of theoretical development of that leading to the scientific revolution in Europe. But this is a minor point. On the whole, the different vantage point that I've taken in this talk, a focus on craftsmen and housewives instead of scholars, has actually by and large corroborated with Professor Yu's overall conclusions about the important contributions of tradition, characterized by the interaction of New Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism to China's modernization. Li Keqiang's repackaging of the new Confucian spirit of the merchant into his spirit of the craftsman, whether we agree with it or not, like it or not, I think that bespeaks the continued usefulness or relevance of new Confucianism to the pathways of contemporary China. So lastly, the spirit of craftsmen. What is the take-home message? I think our search for the spirit of the craftsman has led to this simple realization. The spirit of the craftsman is a rhetorical construct that is meant to signify values that are external to the craftsman's pursuits, be it Richard Sennett's Democratic Society or Li Keqiang's Made in China 2025 project. The spirit of the craftsman is a rhetorical device that does not signify the subjective experience and worldviews of the craftsman. It does not mean that artisans have no spirit or inner life. It simply means that the latter is seldom articulated in words, only always already in the thing and the product they made. Both the tangible material and the intangible or spirit are inherent in the perfect thing and nowhere else. Nowhere else. We have to look for it there. Be that as it may, we have found two vastly different spirits of the craftsman in Chinese history and society. One is a modern construct, despite its superficial resemblance with the spirit of the merchant in his focus on new Confucian teachings of Jingye, Jinxin in the Song and Ming as expounded by Yu Ying-shih. This modern spirit of craftsman or merchant is being used today by PRC leaders to train a workforce that is capable of pushing the economy to a higher level towards a transition to a high-tech and post-manufacturing form of consumerist capitalism. The other spirit of craftsmen is also rooted in the Confucian tradition, but reaching further back to the 5th century BCE when the classic Kaogongji took shape in the state of Qi. My argument is that it is also a connective orientation, but instead of connecting the craftsman to the fellow citizens in Sennett's definition, it connects the craftsman to the material environment, to the stones and metals, animals, birds, fishes, water and soil, sun and rain. Not only is this vision of the craftsman's craft and artistry more inclusive of non-elite workers, especially the housewife, its ecological awareness and multi-species affinity also makes it, to me, a more appropriate spirit for humanity in our age of Anthropocene and climate change. Instead of the teleological expectation implied in the first formulation that the spirit of the merchant or craftsman will eventually lead to capitalism, this alternative vision invites us to redefine the meaning of life or livelihood by learning from the artificer who collaborates with nature to build connections between the human and non-human worlds. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Ko, for a very rich and layered lecture. I think that you have very successfully blurred the academic disciplines of history, sociology, and anthropology, and it's a lot to take. I find myself having a difficult time to accept the conclusion that craftsmanship is a rhetorical construct. And for that reason, I also take issue with your argument about, or this equivalence between housework and craftsmanship. As a part-time house husband myself, I'm a full-time worker at the university, so I consider myself only a part-time house husband. I do my limited share of housework. I do take great pride in my work as a dishwasher. I use different sponges for doing different kinds of cleaning for dishes. I stack my dishes in a very particular way, such that all the dishes will dry in a very short period of time. No water droplets will linger in that kind of dishes. Now, but to call myself a craftsman in dishwashing, I think would belittle that term. And in fact, if not to belittle craftsmen as we know it. So taking that as an analogy, with due respect to all the housewives, including my own wife, my beloved wife, and my mother, I am not sure if they would agree with that equation either, because making a great meal, performing all the household chores in a very rhythmic, professional, time-efficient, cost-effective way, can we really convince ourselves that will give that person the same level of satisfaction as a product that they would make? Whether it is a vest that they would, embroider and or other products that they make. So I think so in your conclusion of calling craftsmanship as a rhetorical construct, then I can see these two things could be parallel, because after all, we may not be talking about a product. But then if that were the case, then the term craftsmanship would be so general to the extent that it may no longer be useful for those of us who really appreciate craftsmanship and a craft. I don't know how to resolve that problem.
Yeah, thank you very much for your attentiveness. But I do have to push back because you are such a precise thinker and speaker. You put two words in my mouth. One is, I said the spirit of the craftsman is a modern rhetorical construct, not craftsmanship. Secondly, I did not use the word equivalence between the housewife and the craftsman. It's your word. To me, but I think that you have captured a central tension in both Richard Sennett's reading of the craftsmanship of the craftsman and my own reading of him. And that tension has to do with exactly your question: who is a craftsman? And as I have hinted also, who is doing the defining? And another question related is, what kind of value system do we attach to this definition? I sense a certain belittling, or at least a certain resistance to accept that housework amounts to real work in many, many quarters. But as scholars, my question is, who is doing that definition, and on what basis are they making this in your word equivalence or the lack thereof? In America, I don't know actually about Hong Kong, but in America, that definition, that housework is not real work, and therefore it does not deserve payment, was solidified in the 1930s, at least in America, solidified in the 1930s by actually the unionists who argue for a union wage. In order to force the capitalists to give them a raise, the factory workers actually say, this is work. And this is dignified work, and dignified work deserves a higher payment. So what is dignified work is written into all of these UAW, all of these union contracts. Dignified work is that performed by a white man. So not only were white women excluded from unionization, so did Black men. So this is the intersectionality of gender and class and race in a nutshell. So in other words, I think the real questions that can be raised is not what I think, but is how a certain society or certain ideology define who is a worker, who is an artisan, and who is not. How much should a real artisan get paid, whether it's respectable work or not, and so on and so forth. And actually, conversely, I would ask the same question of who in society, under what conditions, do we put the scholars on top of the hierarchy? I'm a scholar, so I said, of course I'll stay up there. But evidently the US voters don't agree. The majority of the voters do not want scholars to be up there.
I don't either.
Yeah, but I think that all of these questions are basically, in the current society, they're up for political debate, but when we are studying the past or other societies, I think we have to ask these questions instead of naturalizing certain power hierarchies.
Yes, please, lady in front, and then the one at the back.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Professor Ko, for this very empowering, insightful, and inspiring talk. Sorry. I have a question in a way that is sort of research related, but also methodologically related. I'm wondering how if we want to study skills, craft, in what ways we can deal with this possible potential tension between the mediality of writing and the mediality of body that actually resists against being written down or being fixed on the page. On the one hand, I think it's related to my own work. I study Mingqing theater, and I want to study like their performers' embodied skills. But but my biggest problem is that the only thing I can find are texts, and in a way they're already mediated through a certain type of writing. So in that sense, how we deal with, you also mentioned about we may use text from the pre-modern period to talk about objects or craftsmen, but how we can tears up those texts to see behind the embodied knowledge or skills, the craftsmen behind those texts. And on the other hand, how we can write as so-called scholars, how we can write about those embodied skills or those craftsmen to avoid, further distancing them from their own experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a really good question. And I think that is the central question that I have struggled with for decades. And I think that many of you who are interested in all of the things that were mentioned have also, so I don't think there's one answer, and I don't think it can be generalized. But I think that what is really useful for me, it's a seemingly irrelevant realization. And for those of you who have read the Chinese translation of my Inkstone book, I have talked about it in the new preface there a lot. The realization is that as scholars, we have to try to see what we do as a form of craft and not a form of highfalutin research or mind work. I think that we have to put our own body into our work, into our own performance. If we keep separating the mind and the body in our own living, in our own lives, then we would always end up bifurcating all of these things which were not bifurcated in the Ming and Qing. They became separated into two only when English syntax and grammar and the missionaries came into China. That's why it's so much easier for me to talk about these things in Chinese, because here no one is so, how to put it? It's just impossible for me to explain to my students that there's no mind-body split. So what? And so on and so forth. But so I think that once you have this realization, because that is also an ideological construct, this split. And in part is a linguistic trick. There are so many ways for us to then put them back when you're reading Ming Qing writings. That I think perhaps is something that I can say that might be generalizable, but otherwise, the theater, there are at least, I think, 3 levels of performance in the theater, and it's just too complicated. Thank you for doing it. I can't do it.
There's a hand up there that came before yours. So yes, please.
He's not here to listen to my taking exception to his comments. I, being a non-scholar and a part-time housewife, I advocate that a good homemaker is indeed a good craftsman. I'm sure you know. And it can be also an object of art, giving you a sense of beauty. So being a homemaker, you can be just below the mark, or just the mark, or above the mark, like that gentleman making dishwashing and art. People who wash dishes can just put them all up and that's it. Whereas if you can devise a system to make sure that it's dry so quickly, that's an art. That's a good craftsman. So don't underestimate the work or the status a housewife or homemaker deserves.
I was going to ask you, has he been married for 10,000 hours?
Well, thank you, Professor Ko. I should now call you Dorothy because when I was a student at your class decades ago, I really enjoy your lecture, and I'm really happy to come back to your lecture again. I have several take away from this lecture, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not think that Dorothy is trying to say that housewife is a craftsman. I mean, although I very much agree with you that, you know, Martha Stewart obviously made her into a international celebrity of housework too. But I think one thing is to deconstruct this binary between the mind and the body, right? Mind work is not necessarily more superior to handwork, right? And I think what you said is the spirit of craftsman. Actually, we are not happy. All of us are not happy with Richard Sennett. But then his discontent is with the machine, right? He doesn't like the machine, and he really wants to come back to the minds of the craftsmen. But I think you really want to even deconstruct that, right? I think one thing you wanted to do is to deconstruct the human-centeredness of craftsmanship. I think that's my major takeaway, which is connected to the way that you mentioned about 天时地利 and 工巧, right? So 工巧 only comes to the third of the category. So the 手巧, it's, you know, as we all would connect with craftsmanship, it's not necessarily the priority of things, but then 天时地利 would come even further, right? Before that. Then that leads me to have two questions that I wanted to ask. So would you consider the current national project of intangible cultural heritage a way of kind of decentering the mind-body binaries too, by identifying more kind of the folklore craftsmen everywhere in the nation? Are you happy with the ways that the values are being assigned according to the current national project? Although it's still, I mean, it's still very much human-centered in the way that then they are still identifying 工艺人 or 文化传人, you know, but it's still very right. Yeah. It's still very much human-centered. But then I think the project still includes some of the factors that you're trying to say, you know, 天时地利, and I think the material surroundings that you highlighted, that is also something that I learned enormously this afternoon. So the first question is intangible cultural heritage project. The second question relates to it's more like a contemporary concern. I feel like, you know, when you said you wanted to pay tributes to a lot of these Chinese housewives, and then of course then you had this picture of the Kang, and then the 中国妇女, you know, like trying to do all this scientific method of trying to light the Kang and then keep it warm, and then at the same time, you know, make meals out of it. And so, you know, they're doing many things with only one Kang. It's certainly very sophisticated kind of work. But then I feel like we are all, I think we are all men and women here, all moving away from that kind of science, that kind of material surroundings. We all aim to be scholarly, like you, and like the learned woman in your books. Mm-hmm. So are we also walking away from, I mean, all of us here, from the spirit of craftsmen that you are trying to, are you trying to resurrect that kind of spirit? I mean, is it your ultimate agenda here?
My ultimate agenda is just to come out of this room alive. I have no other agenda. But I think that you have raised so many interconnected issue. So I really love your reading of what I'm trying to do, you know, deconstructing the mind-body binary, but also kind of deconstructing the very modern understanding of craft, which is completely human-centered, but also not only human-centered, but individual-centered. Instead of as a collaboration between past, present, and future generations, but also between different crafts fields. And this is something that I feel very strongly about. I think that it's also applicable to our work as scholars, even though we, you know, in the humanities, we published our work under our own names, but you and I know that our students also, so you also help me to write my books, and your students now also help you write your book through talking, and so very often they will get, you know, nuts and berries from the field to xiaojing the teachers, right? So ultimately in the field of, you know, history of craft or craft studies, it comes down to another modern construct, which is the hierarchy of art over craft. In the Qiguo, in the Warring States, in the Greco-Roman, art is craft. Artistry means both. The separation is actually the most deadly when you really try to understand what crafts meant. Craft is Francesca Bray's technology, is Francesca Bray's culture. There's no other way to stay alive, to be alive, to interact with the physical environment. And the physical environment should not even be called the physical environment, because the minute you say environment means that there's already this modern sense of the body as the container and the skin as the boundary between self and others. That nay, why inner outer distinction did not exist. That's to a large extent. I mean, of course, some sense of it existed. Intangible heritage, I don't know. I still want to go to China, so I will not say anything.
We're running short on time, so may I leave the last question to myself? I'm a fan of Max Weber's, and so I always defend him. You have a spirit, the spirit of capitalism, and you have capitalism, and they're very different things. And so you can have the spirit of the craftsman, and you can have the craft, and they're very different things. You know, one could say you could have the spirit of capitalism without ever being capitalist, or you can be capitalist without ever having the spirit of capitalism. They're just two different things. And the younger Weber went into the spirit of capitalism, and because he was interested in comparing societies, so he looked at China, he looked at India, but he in looking at China, he wasn't just looking at the spirit. He went into things like currency, government, and other things beyond religion. Unfortunately, you know, poor Weber, that's the only bit that the China historians read of Weber, and he knew nothing about China. He was totally wrong. So, I mean, we shouldn't waste time arguing with Weber on China. You know, poor man, he just didn't know.
He just didn't know.
But he wrote a very big book about capitalism, and he knew a lot about capitalism. That's a different thing, and there's nothing to do with the spirit of capitalism. The second thing I want to say is that as you were speaking, it reminded me, I think it was David Oistrakh who went to China when Geiger Kaifang began, the violinist. And there was a short film made of his tour in China. And I remember one scene very well, where he was giving these master's classes to students. And then a student asked him, you know, how much time he's been practicing. And apparently he spent hours practicing every day. And so the students were surprised and said, you know, master like you, why would you need to spend so much time practicing? And his answer was, he said, I know what is good. And so I have to practice until I get to that.
Mm.
You know, being the master, he knows what is good. Now, that isn't quite spirit, it is knowledge.
Mm.
But one could interpret it as spirit, somebody who goes after what is good and he knows what it is.
Mm.
But most violinists are not David Oistrakh.
So they can practice.
They can practice for hours,
Yeah.
they will never make it, you know, most of them are. And so one would look at the crafts world in the same way. You know, you will have one or two individuals who know what is good, who will spend 100,000 hours until they get to that stage. But most of them don't really get to that.
Yeah.
They do what they can, and when there is a market, they push it into the market.
Yeah.
Which brings me back to Li Keqiang. That seems to me to be quite close to what he is saying.
Mm. Mm.
China was coming out of an economy where you were constantly short of what you had to sell. And therefore, whatever you make, you could sell. You didn't have to think about quality.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when you're getting into abundance and your customers have a choice, they force on you the competitive element.
Mm.
And so you have to improve. So in a sense, Li Keqiang fitted very well in with the time in the way you were explaining it.
Yeah.
Have I got you right?
Absolutely. I think Li Keqiang is very, very smart. And I also think that, you know, going back to, you know, what Carmen was saying about Senate and machine, I think that what Li Keqiang did, to me, the smartness of his configuration is to inculcate the spirit of craftsmen onto the factory workers who are handling machines, because he wanted to retrain them or figure out how to retrain them, make them into, say, the master leather makers in Tuscany. But what he wanted, at least for certain sectors of the economy, is to use AI and fuzzy logic and all of those flexible manufacturing tools to get there, which means that the factory workers were no longer relevant. So that, I don't know what he had in mind. So, you know, from the point of view of development, that kind of structural transformation, if you look at America, was the Jianbing, the leaders were actually the entrepreneurs. But of course, we know in hindsight that at the time already the entrepreneurs were already not being favored. So there's a struggle there. In 2016, the first target audience were the factory workers and the managers. And in 2017, there was some half-assed attempt to expand it into the entrepreneurs. And I think that so you are absolutely right. And I think that also it's brilliant in saying that one can be a capitalist without the spirit and vice versa. So I think that Li Keqiang was playing with the spaces in between these categories because some were possible and some were not. Anyway, but that's quite something else.
And we shall end this very interesting session with those comments. you would join me in a big clap for Professor Ko.
Thank you again to Professor Ko and Professor Fore. Also, thank you, audience, for the great contribution to our discussion. The Yu Ying-shih Lecture in History 2024 and 25 has now come to an end. We would like to thank you all once again for joining us this afternoon. You are now welcome to scan the QR code on the back page of the lecture booklet and fill in the online opinion survey to share with us your views. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you next year again.
Yes, ultimately, what capitalism is. The more we live, I mean, the more the world evolves, the less we know. We can take so many
Wait, we never know enough. We never know enough about the world.
No, or what capitalism means, as we now have so many different